Thank you very much. I can't see any of you, but I'm assuming you can see us and hear us. And very briefly, by way of introduction, I do legal sociology. I advise the government of Pakistan on law reform. I don't get anywhere. And I write, which is why I've gone into historical fiction. I have three really wonderful, amazing, relatively new voices. I mean, I shouldn't call you a new voice. You've published 2 books, but you are a writer making her mark, and I think it gives us, those of us who follow South Asian literature and Pakistani fiction, a great amount of pleasure to see the diversity and the versatility of Pakistani writing. And we'll get an opportunity to both find out more about your respective works and your writing process, but hopefully also to have a broader conversation about literature in general and Pakistani fiction. So, Sarvat, you've written, of course, The White Knight, and your latest book, You Can't Go Home Again. One is a novel, which was very well regarded, and the other is a set of interconnected short stories. Zarrar, on my right, has written a new novel called Pureland, and we'll talk a bit more about what's it about. It's a very interesting book. And Taymour, you've published Taymour Soomro, Philosophy of the Foot in the New Yorker, but you're well on your way to finishing a book as well. So I guess I want the three of you to talk a bit about your work, but I perhaps want to pose a broader question and use that as a tool to maybe sort of attract you into talking about your specific work briefly. Who do you write for? And does that impact? I mean, do you consciously think about that question, who's your audience? And does that impact how and what you write? We can start in any particular order. Taymour, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I find it really, when I'm in the process of writing, I find it inhibitive to think about an audience. If I think about like anyone reading that work, it just stops me from writing anything at all.
Okay.
So but of course we have to, I want people to read my work, and I want to publish, and so I have to think about who's going to read it at some stage. And I suppose, there's a Marlon James interview where he talks about his reader being a middle-class white woman. Those are the people who buy books, So if you want to sell books, that's who you should write for. And I guess I think really about a Western audience, but I also think about a Pakistani audience. And I would hate for a Pakistani audience to read my work and find it fraudulent. But of course, to be commercially viable, I need to be able to sell in the US, in the UK, in Europe.
Sure. But Sarvat, that's a dilemma, isn't it? I mean, at one level, we are defined by our cultural influences, where we grew up. That's where we borrow most of our inspiration from. There's also the aspiration to be global, to be universal in one's message and in one's appeal. Does that create a contradiction? And I'll specifically come to your books later, because I think this question becomes very poignant in the context of how and what you write.
I don't think it's a contradiction. Can people hear me? I don't think it's a contradiction so much as, because I do think you have to write your first draft with, I think Stephen King says you have to write your first draft with the door closed, sort of imagining that no one is ever going to read it. You have to write your first draft almost purely for yourself. And then after that, it's in the editing process, and as you're sort of shaping the stories and shaping whatever you have into a novel, that you begin thinking about who's going to read this, what are they going to like. You think about like whether your audience is going to be Western or whether your audience is going to be Eastern. But I don't really think it feels like that much of a conflict to me.
Okay.
Because I think if you've written, it sounds a little bit trite, but if you've written a really good book, anybody should be able to pick it up and find it interesting.
That's interesting. But don't you think, Zarrar, that the politics of a book, for instance, may be more appealing to one particular audience as compared to others, or the cultural sensitivities? Was that a factor at all in what you wrote?
Can everyone hear me? All right. I didn't really think about an audience, but I think it's important, especially for a book like mine, that the individual pens create the moral space for everyone to breathe, right? So for me, and especially for any culture and socio-political discourse, it's important to understand that voices are going to be different from everywhere. You can't have, streamline yourself into one medium and try and present that to the world. So for me, it was very important to bring in for the book, the feudal aspect of a feudal town of a villager who's born and goes on to great things.
Okay.
So I don't think isolating an audience in mind really helped me.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your book, because I guess the selection of terms is important. Is it a book based on the life of Dr. Abdul Salam, the Nobel laureate, or is it a book inspired by him, or does it deal with an archetypical character facing that kind of a situation? It's a book which is really significant for what it shows in terms of discrimination against the Ahmadi community, but it has so many other facets as well. Do describe it a bit.
Yeah, so 20 years ago, not to give my age away, but I was a physics
You're about
major.
25, I think. So.
I was a physics major in college, and I came across this story about a boy who was born in a feudal town, goes on to win the Nobel Prize in physics, and then is completely eradicated from that society. And I felt extremely saddened by the fact that I had to leave the country of my birth to find out about this man.
Okay.
And the more I, researched his story, the sadder I got, right? So there was a lot of magical elements in his story. For example, he didn't speak until the age of 3, and his father, took him to a soothsayer, who said, this when he starts speaking, the whole world is going to listen. So the father could have done one of two things: one, ignore that,
Sure.
or two, he gave him books and taught him mathematics. And he went on to change the world of, physics forever.
Sure, sure.
So that's the story. And I started it in the nonfiction form, but it just didn't work. It was
That's
just a lousy story. So it had to have, and literature gives you that liberty, right? To kind of create an imaginative world, which is still rooted in the real, but bringing in magical elements.
Okay. We'll come to the magic realism part of it as well, whether that was conscious or why did you use that technique. And Sarvat, I had the pleasure of reading your collection of short stories, You Can't Go Home Again, and what struck me was how cosmopolitan these characters are. In a way, it's a tribute to their multifariousness. They could be from any social, cultural context, but there is also something particularly Pakistani about them. But do you find this description rather limiting, that you are a Pakistani fiction writer, or do you think these characters are much more cosmopolitan? And my, I guess, related question is, which takes me to this distinction made between literature in English and English literature by a much more radical Salman Rushdie many, many years ago in Imaginary Homelands. Is that something you feel? Because this categorization that you write literature in English, you're a Pakistani writer, or a Pakistani origin writer?
I think it felt very different for my two books. So You Can't Go Home Again is a set of interconnected short stories, and they're quite contemporary. So they begin with a group of teenagers in a Karachi high school, I guess, and they're putting on their version of The Crucible. And during the rehearsal period, one of them goes missing. And even though he comes back, there's clearly something wrong with him. And it's clear that there's some dark force within their community. And you see this group of teenagers basically through the rest of their life. So you see them later when they're in their 20s, and then when they're in their 30s and in their 40s, and something's haunting them, and it keeps them all sort of connected to each other. And when I was writing it, I think it's interesting what you were saying about them feeling cosmopolitan or universal, because I think what I was attempting was almost the exact opposite. Like I really wanted to hone in on a very specific sort of, and quite tiny part of even the population of Pakistan who have a certain range of choices, and see how, I think that's a lot of what writing is, isn't it? It's putting characters, it's like playing a game.
Sure.
You put characters in different situations and they have to make choices according to the options that are given to them.
Sure.
And I think that's what makes it a Pakistani book, because the situation that they're in is very, very specific. The kind of, the options that are there for them, how traditional their parents are, varies from each character. Whether they will have the option to go to university abroad varies within each character. And the choices that each character makes within their specific set of circumstances is what defines them.
Would you think that the way you've described these upwardly mobile or slightly upper middle class characters pursuing universities, auditioning for the Crucible, would they be very different from their counterparts in Bombay?
It's hard to say. I've had Because You Can't Go Home Again has been published in India, and actually I've had readers who did grow up in Bombay or did grow up in India who've related very strongly to it, because there is obviously this cultural kinship, but also because a lot of the stories and everything that we were all feeding on was so similar. I mean, it's probably even more so now, but in that sense, there isn't that much difference, because the TV shows and the music and the movies and everything that I was fed on as a teenager would be very, very similar to a teenager in Bombay. But perhaps the other sort of cultural or structural limitations within my life would be different.
Perhaps, yes. Okay, so Taymour, coming to your very compelling short story, Philosophy of the Foot, I guess it resonates at so many levels. I mean, class is incredibly important, and sexuality. And so my question was really that from a writing standpoint, does one have to transcend in some ways one's class experience in order to imagine somebody else's class experience? Is that a conscious thing? Do you actually sort of do osmosis, interface with people, or is that something which is purely observational?
Yeah, I think that's the exciting thing about both reading and writing, is that opportunity to, like, be someone else. So when I was writing that piece, to, like, you mentioned the class divide. So there's an upper middle class man in his 40s who's, maybe not that different from me, and then he has an affair with a boy who sells shoes on the street, who's very different from me. And so imagining that boy's experience, that was a really interesting and exciting thing for me to do. And that was actually more interesting and exciting for me than imagining, the character who was more similar to me.
Exactly. So it strikes me, since you mentioned the theme somewhat, what's a commonality at one level between very different works which the three of you produced is that you are tackling some taboos. Whether it's the sexuality kind of a conversations in some of your characters engage in, or the sort of empowerment dimension, whether it's the minority discrimination dimension in your work. And it strikes me that we had 3 wonderful sessions this morning, and in the context of art, I think this conversation was taking place whether the politics of it or the dissent of it should be one of the prevailing things or not, the politics of what we write. Did the idea of dealing with the taboo come to you first, or did the story come first? And therefore, you thought that this is how I'm going to deal with this, or this is what my politics on this subject is. Any of you? All 3 are equally qualified to answer this. So.
I feel like for me, when I read, I don't really want to see politics on the surface. I don't want to know what someone's political thinking is right on the surface. I don't want to be lectured. I don't want to be didactic.
You don't want to be patronized.
Right, I don't want to be patronized.
You don't want to be told what to think by
and
the
what's
shape
right.
of the story.
Exactly, and I mean, also personally, I'm not, a political activist, and so for me, the politics comes second, but I think it's inescapable for someone's politics or their philosophy on life or their ideology not to be there under the surface of any, any
But your story is so political.
Right, but what interested me more was not the political as much as like these 2 people and the relationship they had and their attempt at intimacy and their failure to find that intimacy.
I think literature often becomes political through the lens of the reader as well. Like there are so many pieces of fiction that now have, certain resonance, regardless of what the author might have intended, because of the way they're read.
Well, that's the nature of open textured language, right? But you could still argue that there are books which are much more patently political, either because of the approach they adopt or the very nature of the selection of the theme. But you're right. I mean, a lot of it is also what people interpret it to be. Now, Zarrar, your novel, I would argue, is also, and when I say something is political, to me it's a huge asset because I do think politics is cardinal. I'm not one of those people who believe in art for art's sake. But having said that, of course, you can't completely overwhelm the artistic side of it. You can't turn into a pamphleteer, hopefully. Your book is also fascinating because it's in the realm, I would say, of historical fiction, right? So, because you are dealing with a historical figure. It's not a history, it's not a biography. Do you think that created a certain additional sort of challenge or pressure?
It did, actually. I don't like story or books that wag a finger at you and tell you or preach too much. I think there's really lousy writing, and you should let the reader, you should allow the reader to be a smart individual to figure things out. So the story itself is not political, as you can tell, but the environment you can't escape.
It's a love story at one.
It's a love story of a man who loves this nation that never loved him back. Right?
And a girl.
And, well, the girl is the symbol behind it, right?
Well, yes.
So this, the entire notion of a love story set in the backdrop of absolute chaos and you know, murder and deceit and just political turmoil. That kind of came naturally with the story because it spans about 5 or 6 decades. And I did a lot of research trying to figure out, you know, what was the environment like? What kind of trees were around, you know? What did they smell like? So when the reader's reading this, he or she is smelling this and sensing all these things.
Your book is very rich in description. I mean, that's very noticeable in terms of the topography, the flora and the fauna, and that sort of makes it real. And
so in Lahore, somebody came up to me and said, how did you know how Lahore was like in 1966? I said, I didn't, but I did a lot of research, and you know, I'm glad that you think this way.
Sure.
And not only just the way things look, but also what is the political atmosphere? And that's very important. And later on, when I was editing the book, I didn't want to veer into the realm of politics, but I think I had to kind of lay down the landscape of what's going on. The important thing is this Pureland can be anywhere, right? And I wanted to make it a global book because the idea of stifling people's liberties is happening as we speak.
Yeah.
So I thought that this was more of a universal theme than just, you know, one land.
Okay. Well, staying with this theme of politics, and you've spoken about it, you said something earlier, but just to pursue it a bit further. You know, it's very easy to slide into becoming a pamphleteer, an apologist, or a cynic when you're writing, especially when you're writing about aspects of society which are quite grievous, which evoke empathy and all that. So, I mean, you're dealing with some really sensitive themes and all that. So, how does a writer sort of guard against the tendency to pontificate, to start pointing fingers? Or, I mean, is it a conscious thing? Because at one level, we really like the stream of consciousness to sort of prevail, right? We don't want to be self-censoring all the time.
I think it's you know, you want to kind of have this balance between having a point of view and then the humility of knowing how little you know. And so kind of like navigating that in fiction as well, so that you know, what I try to do is I try to ask myself and ask the reader more questions. And you know, I don't really know the answers to those questions, but I'm setting up the scenario and saying, look, what do you think? Who do you have sympathy for in this?
Sure. So another thing which I wanted to talk to you about, and I think it applies equally to me because I'm a comparative newcomer to fiction. I write, as I said, legal history and constitutional law kind of treaty work. There is this human tendency to go for typologies, right? So you are new writers, you have to be bracketed somewhere. So I spoke earlier about writing in English and English writing, and I spoke about... So there's this interesting blurb which I came across as I was researching you guys. Here is the real Pakistan of Mohsin Hamid and Kamla Shamsi, one generation younger, that's you, and a young storyteller to take on the legacy of Pakistan's chroniclers. And it immediately raised the questions in my mind. How do you feel about this role allocation of carrying somebody else's legacy? And have you come across one real Pakistan somewhere?
I think it's a huge burden to place on a writer to say that any one writer is writing the real Pakistan. I think there is a great advantage at the moment for Pakistani writers in the sense that there is this tradition to step into, which I think there wasn't always.
No.
Whereas there's so much exciting new writing in English and without, but especially in English, I think. So when, I think you were there as well, at the Lahore Literature Festival in Lahore, there was such really, really interesting new books and lots of really exciting new voices, and that's a really fun thing to be a part of. And I think my way of dealing with the other side of that, of like feeling that burden of representation, and actually coming back to what we were talking about earlier with trying to have like a political point of view, is that it's a lot easier if you write a book of short stories than if you write a novel, because you immediately have the room to represent lots of different points of view. So there are certain themes that recur in all of the stories and You Can't Go Home Again, like things to do with the supernatural and things to do with sexuality and things to do with empowerment and things to do with people's place in the world. And because it was a collection of short stories and because I could have lots of different perspectives,
Sure.
I could explore different versions of the same people. So because they all went to school together, there is immediately this sort of generational timestamp on them.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't all have the same views. Just
No.
because they're reading the same things and going to the same schools and because their parents are sort of roughly similar doesn't mean they all behave in the same way. And that was a really, really interesting thing to be able to explore. I think especially with the female characters in the book, because I think there is this idea of a Pakistani woman or a young Pakistani woman who, and this idea that they all share the same values, but that's not true. Everyone has their own boundaries and everyone has their own sets of expectations for how their life is going to look.
Okay. So it's interesting. So you mentioned that the fact that there's already a rich tradition of Pakistani fiction in English is in some ways an advantage because there are reference points and all that. So let's talk a little bit about this more generic sort of subject. There can be various kinds of categorizations and periodizations of Pakistani fiction, and people have written. But I would say, broadly speaking, apart from the earlier books, in the 80s you find this search for the Pakistani idiom. There's a lot of Pakistani poetry in English. Then you start getting some of the novelists who are quite well known now, and they start getting published abroad. There's the immigrant experience, but there's also this notion that they are really writing not just for a Pakistani audience, but an international audience as well. And now there's, frankly, in the last 3 to 4 years, and Indian publishing houses has a lot to do with that as well. A plethora of Pakistani authors publish in India, some of whom have also published in the West. Mm-hmm. It's a fairly diverse landscape. How do you, I mean, is the Pakistani fiction being written in English even a reference point for you? Is that something which inspires or provokes you? Did you think that it was lacking?
I find this a really annoying question.
Oh, really?
Because, I mean...
Oh, wait, I have another three.
The thing is, like, once you call... If you were supposed to... if you call someone a Pakistani writer, first of all, you know, more than half of the population doesn't read. And the population that does read doesn't read books. They don't read novels. So you're like really pigeonholing yourself. So I would like to think of myself as, you know, a universal writer, and I think these guys would agree. When I started writing, I pitched the book as a New York story because it is. It's an American novel, and I like to think, you know, I'm as American as cheeseburgers and type 2 diabetes, and also like, you know, that brings with it a global universality to it. So I think. Is your question that why do we write in English, or is
no,
it
that was not my question. My question was whether. So let me annoy you again. My question was: there's diverse Pakistani fiction coming out now.
Right,
was that even a reference point,
no.
inspiration at all for any of you guys?
Yeah.
For me, no.
I think that you know, and you were talking about this a little, Sarvat. I think that this, you know, the pigeonholing as a Pakistani writer. Okay, it can be reductive, but it can also provide a platform like this platform. But, you know, for me, when my stories were pitched to the New Yorker, they wanted the pieces that were set in Pakistan. Yeah. They didn't want the pieces that were set elsewhere, you know, and actually that I had an opportunity to publish in the New Yorker because I was writing about something that people had not heard about, because I was writing about a Pakistan that people had not heard about. So there are, you know, it's reductive, but there are huge opportunities as well, I think.
No, but it can be looked at in so many ways. Let me push you back, all of you. We've had too many friendly sessions. Let's have that. Everybody was smiling, so
bring it on.
Let's look at it this way. We can define who we are as writers either by identifying the people we want to talk to, or we can give primacy to the fact that these are the imperatives which are driving us to write, and we don't care who it's going to be. Or it can be an incredibly conscious decision about what the target audience is. I can only speak about my experience. I wrote for a South Asian audience. I wrote for a South Asian audience because I did not want to be in a position where either I have to exoticize South Asia or have an not that all people do that, but I don't want to pick up.
But there is a pressure sometimes, I think.
There is a pressure.
There is
a pressure. Now, my name is Osama. I
within...
should really be writing about 9/11. But I chose to write about the Indus Valley civilization, right? So now you automatically limit your choices in terms of where your book will go, right? So you are making a very conscious marketing decision as well. But I wanted this story to be told to fellow South Asians because I had a certain reason for doing that. Obviously, we all hope that if we are universal enough, others will recognize something universal in it. But I can equally imagine and appreciate and respect other ways of approaching who we are. I think this is an important political choice. Is this a factor at all? Or is it just that you want to do storytelling, and the storytelling takes primacy, which is very important, and the rest of it sort of sorts itself out on its own?
So I think as a writer, I completely understand your sort of reluctance to be categorized and that push against categorization, either as a Pakistani writer, and I've had this sort of twofold because a lot of books by women get pigeonholed as women's fiction.
Sure.
And I've met people at literary festivals and had like conversations with them, and they've been like,
or African fiction, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, but as a woman, it's different because you do get sort of like, men won't read your books. Like I've had conversations with people at literary festivals where they then asked me, they've been like, oh, I just went and bought your book because we had a really nice chat, and could you please sign it for my sister? It's like, it's not, I mean, it won't reduce your manhood if you read it. Like it's not,
it's annoying.
You'll be fine. But at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, I used to work in publishing and I've worked as an editor before, and there is an inherent need for categorization within the industry because otherwise you wouldn't know how to sell books. And I've been on panels where people have been like, we shouldn't call anything women's fiction, and all of these labels are demeaning, or we shouldn't call anything, you know, fiction by non-white writers or anything like that. And, you know, but if you take that to its extreme and you say nothing should have any categories, you'd walk into a supermarket and pick up a can and not know if there were going to be beans in it or tomatoes.
Do you think it's a phase? Do you think it's the same with Indian fiction now?
I don't think it's the same. I think it's...
There's a lot of stuff still
the
coming
about
about
for categorization, I think,
shows
is
a
similar
mango pickle
across,
or a curry or things like that. But there's
paisley covers.
But people like Rohinton Mistry, Amitav Ghosh, I think have really sort of... So do you think it's a phase? And I also find it restrictive, but in a country's literature, you mentioned African literature, there is a certain genealogy to it, right? So the Chinua Achebes of the world arrive at a certain historical moment. There's post-colonialism. The great Latin American literature talks about all those dictators. You know, so the history, the context, and the politics can be significant, as you're also saying, in terms of defining a moment. But do you think in some ways it's also a phase that a region's fiction goes through?
I think that identity politics, it's a necessary part of a process for representation. You know, to have a marginalized voice heard, like the identity politics seems kind of critical. But, you know, we don't, you know, when we talk about like British fiction or American fiction, what do we mean? Like, I have no idea what that might be, but like Pakistani fiction has an identity, you know, and we kind of need it in a way to have our voices heard. But ultimately, maybe the hope is that we wouldn't need it, you know, that we would just be, you know, too diverse.
I think it's also a personal bind, isn't it? Because everyone can recognize the need for representation and identity politics in Pakistani fiction, but at the same time, everyone wants to be the writer, where it's like, no, my book would be picked up no matter who I was,
right,
because it's such a remarkable voice, and
it's also going
sort of wrestling with that within yourself, I think.
And I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to come up, you know, just stick to that category of Pakistani fiction and which three books typify it, even though some people are still doing it. I mean, even your three works are quite different, frankly, from each other, which shows the diversity. I wanted to go to some specific themes in your book. So what struck me, Sarvat, in your collection of short stories was also the element of the supernatural. There is a tradition of doing it. I mean, I was immediately reminded of the great Urdu and Punjabi poet Munir Niazi, who uses the supernatural quite a lot. But what was what sort of inspired you, and what are you trying to do with that? It's very effective.
So I've always been interested both within the way supernatural occurs in literary fiction and magical realism and the uncanny and all of those themes, but specifically within short stories. I think short stories are a really great way to write horror even, because you can make one quick thing happen and you can do a change that will sort of like turn people on the head if you pull it off. And the supernatural specifically was really interesting to me. And I wanted to have, I was saying earlier that I wanted to have a range of characters. So within this, I wanted to have a range of characters who were each responding to the supernatural in different ways. So you have Maliha, who's a soap opera actress who seeks out black magic as a way to gain control of her life and to sort of seek a kind of empowerment. And that was interesting to me because I feel like Pakistani soap operas are where the conversations are happening now. That's you were saying that so few people read, but almost everyone watches those TV shows, and that's where a lot of the national conversations and big debates are happening, and they deal with things like black magic. And then I also wanted to have a character who is quite religious and traditional and almost afraid of it. And then you have two characters who have left Pakistan. They sort of bookend the book, Shireen and Kareem, and they have moved to the UK and they've moved all to the US, and they feel like they've cut Pakistan off their bones. They feel like they've shed the superstition, they've shed the religion, they've shed any sense of national identity.
Sure.
But then the supernatural comes back into their life and they are suddenly confronted by it. And that's why it's the idea that you can't go home again, but you can't ever really leave either. And I guess that's been coming up quite a lot in this conversation. You know, is our identity something that we're choosing, or is it something that's clinging to us?
Okay. Do any of you engage with Pakistani fiction written in languages other than English? Is that part of, because it does play a role in my sort of universe, but it doesn't have to, but is that something?
Yeah, I was really inspired by Sarvat Hasin and his storytelling technique. It was very, to the point. And the development of characters and stuff like that, I think I learned a lot from him. A lot of Punjabi poetry that I read was also, inspired the way I wrote in English. So I think I wanted to write the story from a point of delinquency, if you know what that means. And coming back to Sarvat's point, the way that the South Asian identity, the technique is so magical, because that's the way we tell stories.
Sure.
We are a really vibrant storytelling creature. So we tell, look at our movies, look at the Punjabi film. A guy is flying around with a bamboo stick and can punch someone like through their stomach. It's awesome, right? So that's the way we tell our stories, where there's like song and dance, and there's angels and demons, and that's what I wanted to put into my narrative.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because your sort of wit comes through at several points, but it's also very noticeably asserting, Punjabi wit in various ways, and some of the character names and all that. So that gives a distinctive flavor to that. So that was something which you obviously wanted to capture.
I did, and I think coming back to how to make that universal, my editor is a young Southern gal from from the U.S. Right? She's right there. And so I wanted to, she also it was so universal that she picked up on it. And then I knew I was doing something right. That if you can take something from a Punjabi village and like a bad word or like a bad phrase or like a joke, and turn it into something really cool, then you're doing something good.
Taymour, how important is craft? I mean, craft can sort of start overwhelming. Now, both of you have done shorter fiction. Your output so far is exclusively short stories. Is that something which writers are you think they should really work on?
For me, it's been really important. I tried writing a novel in my 20s, and it was terrible. And it was terrible for many reasons, but one of the reasons was craft. And so when I later on did a creative writing program, then that was an opportunity to really focus on craft, to read a lot, to write a lot, to fail a lot. And
you're pursuing a doctorate, I believe, in creative writing as well.
That's right, yeah. So for me, craft is almost everything, really, because...
Right.
Because,
is that a creative writing thing? Is that something you catch there, or is that, the creative writing courses and all that, and MFAs?
I feel like there is a bit of snootiness sometimes with writing programs that you don't see with with a fine arts. When someone studies fine arts or studies painting, nobody says, "Oh yeah, but
you can't."
Why do you think about the craft? You should just be able to do it. And with writing, I think it's the same. It takes there are things that you can do, that everyone can do well in a piece of writing, and there are things that, I think just focusing on that, at least for me, it was very, very useful.
Okay. So there's so many other possibilities in terms of what we want to talk about. I think it's also really important to celebrate the three of you and the fact that you come up with these exciting new works. So I would really encourage everyone to sort of read these 3 new voices. We have about 5 to 6 minutes. I think we could take a couple of questions. Somebody will help me to pick who should ask the question. I'm completely blinded. Any questions about Pakistani fiction or these particular authors? I can't see anyone, so. No questions? I've got plenty more. Okay, please go ahead.
Hi. Just purely out of curiosity, how long did it take each of you to sort of start and then your process, essentially?
I think it varies from book to book. So I wrote my first novel I wrote the first third of on a creative writing master's, and sort of met my agent at the end of it, and he liked the novel, so we worked on it together, and I ended up finishing it fairly soon, so it probably took me maybe a little over a year to write the whole thing. And the short story collection was quite quick as well. But the novel I'm working on at the moment, I've probably been working on in some form or the other for 4 years now.
Yeah,
and it's closer to being finished.
I think 5 or 6 years is for me it took about five years. But also during that time I was learning my craft, right? So I was trying to learn as I went along.
So novels are long. I think we were talking about creative writing degrees earlier, and I think you get a lot of good and bad advice on creative writing degrees, and you get tutors telling you things like, you won't make any money, and look out for the bad reviews, and there's quite a lot of cautioning. And I think if any of them had said, this is going to take you a really long time, a lot of it is going to be really boring, you're going to start to hate your story,
It's a laborious process,
quite a lot of it, yeah.
A very lonely one.
Yeah. I mean, a novel, it's what? An average novel is between sort of like 60 to 80,000 words. Yeah. That's a lot of words.
Yeah, I know. For me,
not to scale.
I know my novel. I've been working on it for years, and I stopped and redrafted because it's very personal, and so turning it into fiction has been very, very, for me, has been very difficult. But like the short stories, I would say maybe like a month a story. But often the ideas were like gestating for a long, long, long time, and I tried to write them before and got them wrong. So sometimes
that's really satisfying when it happens, though.
Definitely.
Sorry.
Please go.
When you have an idea and you've sort of written. So the title story in You Can't Go Home Again, I wrote a version of on my creative writing masters, and wrote it as like part of my end of first year project, and it was okay, but it wasn't really there, and it didn't really work. And then I think maybe 3 years after that, it came out in one long stream, and I wrote it in about 2 weeks, and it was almost perfect as it was. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't written that other version of it that broke my brain.
Please.
That's great. Congratulations to the 3 of you for producing such excellent works, which I still have to read. I'm going by what. Now
we'll take the compliment.
The saying goes that everybody has a book in him.
And for most people, that's where it should remain. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, the urge is there. I mean, that's your critical eye. Yeah. But the person who's thinking that believes that he can and will produce a work. So what I wanted to say is that what is the initiating impulse that makes a person want to write?
Very good question.
Unemployment?
Good question.
I don't know.
No, I think it's just one of those things that wakes you up at night and you have to do it. It's one of those things.
But it's not always just that.
For me, it was definitely that, because I knew this story of this man has to be told. It was burning me, inside, and I had to tell this tragic story. For me, that was my angle. I don't know, for other people it might have been different. But that stayed with me for so long, and if for anything else, I wanted to do it for him.
No lost sleep for you?
I mean, obviously I think you should have I think that burning desire and that impulse is great, and most people who've written a novel will have had that. But beyond that, it's sustaining it. It's not just that initial spark of an idea. That's why I think so many people think they have a book in them. I mean, I have lots of people who will say, I've got a great idea for a book. And that's one part of it. And then it's sustaining that burning desire over, 4 or 5 years. That's really difficult. And a lot of it is quite boring graft. It's not a very romantic thing to say, but a lot of that is just sort of sitting at your computer being like, this isn't happening. Nothing is coming out today. I wish I could do something else. I have a friend actually who is a writer as well, and when we were writing our first books, we wrote them sort of sitting at the same kitchen table. And anytime one of us was having a bad day, we would say, I'm going to quit writing and I'm going to become a whale rider, because that seemed like a more realistic aspiration than finishing a book.
But what about your relationship with the language? Doesn't that contribute a share in it?
Of course, but I think that's also something
you might
that...
have a book inside, but
yeah.
you don't have the language.
The language for it, yeah.
I do think that's also part of the evolution, though, because I think when you're writing, you're not necessarily writing the book you're going to publish. You're writing the book that's in your head, and anything can change between that first draft and, you know, the thing that people will eventually hold in their hands.
Taymour?
I mean, I think also it comes down to, as you were mentioning, this perseverance and the will. You know, you have a book in you, you have an idea, great. Now sit down and do it and show me the book. And if you can really stick at it and do it badly and do it badly and do it badly and then do it okay and then do it a little better and then do it well, you know, then okay, yeah, it's great.
Do we have time for one more? One more.
Yeah, thank you so much. Craft is a very important word in all the forms of art, including the literary arts. So for the two persons on the panel who addressed craft briefly, what are your own definitions of craft?
I think for me it's reading. I think for me so I did a creative writing master's as well, and I feel like they're great in the sense that obviously it's really, really good to have the structure of it. It's really, really good to have, you know, you meet amazing tutors. But a lot of it is just taking in things, and it's very difficult to separate from almost imitation, because you do want to. I think there's a divide in this in writers. I think there are some writers who, when they are writing, don't want to be reading very much, and definitely don't want to be reading anything that would be similar to what they're trying to produce. But
Or
I'm the
which
absolute
gives one
opposite.
an inferiority complex, you know.
Yeah, but I'm the absolute opposite. I will sort of like, I want to be the sponge. I want to.
I think it's this point of imitation, but like for me, like when you could think about the craft it takes to like make a table. You know, okay, you hold your chisel like this, or so in the same way with writing, I think there are ways to construct a story. There are ways to build character, and in a way, it's a starting point, because once you know those ways, then maybe you can try and find other ways or better ways, but it usually helps, or it helped me at least, to know that first before trying my own way.
We could have several other things to discuss, but I believe we've run out of time. Thank you to the three of you for all your insights and for your books. Thank you to you.